Hi guys, welcome to the episode. This is going to be a two-parter. Part 1, making the Age of Empires 2 barracks in roughly 28mm scale. So to start with, we're going to grab some foam core, we're going to make a base, bevel the edges. This turns out to be pointless later, but I still did it. Then we're going to cut lengths for the exterior walls. If you've not seen the barracks, it's kind of an H shape with a courtyard in the front and a building in the back with a gate in front of it. So, with all the outline walls cut out, we're going to glue them to the base. Now, there's a few variations of the barracks depending on what civ you're playing, but they're all 90% the same. It's just a bit of the exterior that looks different. So this is probably the most generic one you can build. I was running low on styrofoam, so I went to the local DIY store, picked up some underfloor laminate insulation, which seems to be 90% the same thing as styrofoam. Doesn't hold detail quite as well, but it comes in thin sheets, which is really good for brickwork. So cutting 4 lengths of this per each of the sides, then score some brickwork into it, and spend a good 10 minutes carving bricks. So, using a metal sculpting tool, going around, pressing brickwork into it, then some cracks, and then finally rolling over it with a tinfoil ball to give it some texture. Now, it's not quite as good for taking in texture from rocks or tinfoil, but it is very good for pressing bricks into. So slightly different use cases from what I was hoping to use it for, but it will still do for its intended purpose. And then, when you're happy with the brickwork, you can glue it onto the foam core. Now, you could use this instead of foam core, just build the entire walls out of it, but it's quite flimsy, so I think it needs the backing of the foam core. Now, with the external walls done, there are 2 internal walls for the courtyard, so cutting 2 more pieces of styrofoam, and using the existing brickwork as a guide for the height of the bricks, and then spend another 10 minutes carving brickwork. And when you're happy with them, glue them to the foam core, and then stick them into the interior. Once those are attached, we're going to need some walkways above them. So we will take 2 more pieces of styrofoam and carve some square flagstones into them. We're then going to soften the edge using a sculpting tool and by squeezing it with our fingers. And then gluing on top of the walls. Now, you may have noticed that on the exterior walls the stonework is only on the top half, and this is because the lower half is a kind of pyramid-shaped foundation. Now, it looks a bit like it's meant to be concrete, and I don't know how historically accurate that is. So, it would probably look better if you just use stonework for it as well, but hey, it's a thing. Now, I'm not going for a completely accurate version to the in-game sprite, but trying to get pretty close. So, gluing the foundation base beneath the stonework. The actual in-game sprite is slightly weird because the entire shape of the building initially looks square, but is in fact an hourglass shape, because the stonework and the base all lean in, and then it goes out again with the kind of palisade on top. So on the corners, we're going to take some L shapes of styrofoam, the good old blue styrofoam this time, and we're going to put cornerstones in. So these are going to be chunkier, and they're going to overlap both the walls slightly. Then we're going to move on to the gatehouse. So with another piece of foam core, we want to cut that to size, and then make a rough entrance by cutting 3 slits in and connecting them at the top. This will form a rough archway that we will then smooth out a bit later. So once you've checked the size of that, we're going to use more styrofoam and clad the entire thing with more brickwork. And we're going to curve some of it to make the arch. And you will need to do this twice, once for the external part and one for the internal. Ideally, if you do this with separate bits of styrofoam, you want to line the edge up where the stonework is, which I mostly do. And then we're going to clean up any of the overhanging bits of styrofoam and spend another 10 minutes doing brickwork. Then using 2 more bits of foam core for the inside of the archway. And we're going to cut triangle shape into the top of 2 more pieces, and this will be the external sides that face the wall. And some more brickwork for them as well. Now, one benefit of this new styrofoam is it's very bendy. So we're going to make the inside of the gateway, and we're going to carve some brickwork on the inside of it. I'd recommend doing that before you glue it in. Now, here is where you check your reference photos and realise the gatehouse is too big. So take your rusty knife and start cutting away. And as always, be careful when cutting towards your thumb. Make sure you use the thumb joint to connect with the handle before the blade connects with the fleshy part. Now we need to go around and cover every edge and corner with some more stonework, using a mantelpiece for the top of the archway. Next, we're going to work on the palisades. So with some balsa wood dowels, we're going to trim them to the right size and use them to give a bit more width onto the walls. I find it helps to roll the dowel when you're cutting it, because then you get an even cut all the way around without it snapping halfway through. And gluing them to the edge of the walls. Before we go too much further, we need to make the ground floor of the back building. So cutting a piece of foam core to width, and some more balsa wood dowel. Now the back building is a very typical looking medieval building where you have plaster between wooden beams. So we're going to use Sculptamold as the plaster, and it needs a door in the middle as well. So we're going to glue the balsa wood down. So we cut the outside of the door out of styrofoam, and it always helps to have a little size reference. Yeah, that looks about right. So, using some wooden coffee stirrers, I'm going to trim them down with the modelling saw. And that's going to be the planks of the door, and glue them inside. Then, with some short pieces of balsa, we're going to have some beams sticking out the top of the door frame to support the upper floor, which is slightly beyond the footprint of the ground floor. Again, one of those typical medieval building styles. And that's all looking good. No complaints, except for the doorway, which is way too small, so we're going to tear that off and redo it. The useful thing about foam core is you can basically scrape off the paper sheet and get rid of any glue residue or bits of foam you have left on the outside, and you have a flat surface to work with again. So this time making the door slightly wider and gluing it straight to the back, and then we're going to build the stonework around it this time. And we're going to use 2 strips of plasticard for the iron bracing on the door. So with 2 strips of styrofoam, we're going to press some more brickwork into them using a metal sculpting tool and glue them on either side of the door. And then with 1 more piece as the top of the arch above the door. I'm not a fan of arch doorways, very hard to do. Then mixing up some Sculptamold, and we want to mix this slightly thinner than we normally do, so slightly more water than 1:1. And we're going to spoon that in between the balsa wood and spread it out as flat as we can, because we want to have a little bit of texture to it. But for the most part, we want this to be a flat panel between the wooden supports. And if you wait 5 minutes or so after first putting down the Sculptamold, it becomes a lot more workable, and you can flatten it down with the side of a blade or a sculpting tool, or even your finger. And while we're playing with the Sculptamold, we're going to take the opportunity to fix our many previous mistakes. So we can use it to fill the gaps between the foundation and the brickwork. We can use it to fill any gaps in the edge of the stones, and anywhere we need to hide something. We're also going to use it to level out the base and add some texture to the internal courtyard and the passage beneath the gatehouse. And again, sometimes it's easier just to use your fingers. Now we're going to move back to the palisade, so with some thin pieces of balsa wood, we're going to cut some arrow holes. And you need to be a little bit careful when cutting out holes in the middle of wood, because it can splinter and split in two, but you can just glue it back together and pretend it didn't happen. So before we glue those on, we're going to make the roof of the gatehouse. So with a piece of cardboard, we're going to trim it down to size and fold it in the middle, and this will form the basis of the roof. Now, I have used foam core for this before, but I find it's a bit too thick, and there's no real good way to cover the kind of height it adds. So with some more strips of cardboard, we're going to cut them about 3/4 of the way, and then go in with a pair of clippers and snip off the hard edges. And then we're going to cut them from longer strips into shorter ones and glue them along. Now, by cutting them into the shorter strips, you get a bit more kind of subtle variance, which looks better in the end. Now, you can use individual tiles if you want, but I find that can end up taking an entire weekend, and that this is a good compromise for it. For the top section, we're going to use a wider piece of cardboard, cut tiles into both sides, and score a line between them. I then glued that on top of the gatehouse. And once that's down, we can attach the palisades on the sides. And giving the corner a small trim. I felt it looked a bit bland, so I grabbed some more of the coffee stirrers, trimmed them to size, and glued them on the outside of the palisade to give it a bit more bulk. Before we glue in the ground floor, we're going to give it a priming of black gesso, because it's going to be a lot easier at this stage, and then gluing that into place. Then we're going to make a basing paste out of a mixture of basing grit and fine and extra fine cork. And we're going to mix that with PVA and then some more black gesso, just so it saves a bit of time priming later and covers some of the sand colour. We're then going to smear that everywhere we want dirt to be. We can also use it to fill some gaps. We're going to use it all over the courtyard. And anywhere where there is a small gap in the stonework, we can plug that up with some grit. And it was a real pain to get it in the courtyard, so just get your finger out. Then, with the black gesso, give everything a nice coating. Now, I'm not going to spend too long on the painting stage here, because once I've done the first floor, it's going to need repainting. This is mostly so I can add some of the later bits, while not then having to worry about painting underneath them. So the stonework goes grey, everything else goes brown, and then we're going to lighten up the woodwork with a kind of pale sand colour, just mixing a bit of white into the initial brown, and keeping with the grain of the wood to try and add a bit of texture. Plaster is getting an even paler shade. It's near enough to white as you can get, just a tiny bit of brown mixed in. And then, mixing that with the grey mixture again, we're going to make a slightly lighter grey, and that is going to be the edge stonework and the foundation. I also gave a very, very light dry brush of that over all the stonework, and a dry brush of pale sand over all of the dirt. The only fancier thing I do with the painting here is get a very watered down black and dab it onto the foundation in a patchy fashion, and then smooth some of it off with my finger to give it a bit more variance. And then with a very light white dry brush, as I said, just a quick base coat so I can add later bits without worrying about the undersides not being painted. There we have part 1. Next episode will be the first floor building and touching up and adding more details. Thanks for watching, guys. Catch you next week.